Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I am an author of fiction. I have published a couple books, a short story collection and a novel, and I'm also artistic director at the Writers Center. So that is how I get to do this wonderful conversation that I'm so excited for this evening. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sequoia Nagamatsu to our virtual stage this evening to celebrate his brand new novel, How High We Go in the Dark. I loved this novel so much. I told him before the event I would gush, so this is gush number one. I really love this novel. I was just so pleased with it. So I was excited for it. It lived up to my every expectation. It exceeded my every expectation. And so I sent you so many questions in advance and I could have just kept going. So I'm so excited to talk about it. Welcome, Sequoia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach, and also Amy. It's just really wonderful to see so many people that I both recognize and people that I don't know at all, here tonight to hear me talk about the book and the journey in writing this book and lots of craft insights, I'm sure.
Yep. So do you have a copy of your book handy? And
I do.
An excerpt for us.
All right. I have actually a page picked out. I'm using the Starship Discovery as a bookmark, and we'll probably talk about Star Trek later on. Okay, so I'm going to read a chapter called Pig Son. This is about halfway through the novel. If you know anything about the novel at all, you'll know that it follows a cast of characters through several generations in the aftermath of a climate plague. And here we have a narrator who's lost his son in a previous chapter. He's a scientist, and he is his line of work is genetically modifying pigs to house human organs for transplantation, which is actually wild since it's something that has actually happened within the last few weeks. There was a pig to human organ donor transplant. So there's that bit of prescience there recently. All right, so it's called Pig Son. After my ex-wife mailed half of my son's ashes to me in an urn, I committed myself to growing the hearts and other organs that might have saved him inside of pigs. It's Fitch's birthday today, which means Dory texts me more than usual, which is pretty much never. Do you remember how I told you that he'd like to fall asleep hugging his new collection of comic books? I've forgotten what he smelled like. I have never responded to these messages. Dory doesn't really want a conversation. She still blames me for not being there in the end. She's never understood how hard I fought trying to save him. A real conversation would be too painful. It's the same reason I've never addressed Fitch's failed transplant in my peer-reviewed articles. His file sits inside my desk rather than among the lab's program records like a lost statistic. My graduate assistant, Patrice, is shouting through the intercom, telling me to come to the lab quickly. I hear another voice I don't recognize, muffled and nasal and a little bit frantic, repeating the word doctor as if it's trying to convey an entire thought with a single word. I pull on my face mask and lab coat, open the outer door of my office. My staff is gathered around one of the glass holding pens where we keep our organ donor pigs. The pigs are all destined to help infected people like my son, whose organs have given way to the plague. The timing is crucial, though. We need to reach the infected before they slip into the comas that mark the advanced stages of the illness. This one, Donor 28, was nicknamed Notorious PIG after an intern put a gold chain and shades on him during a Halloween party. The pig studies me as I approach, wiggling its behind, and barely opens its mouth. Doctor. The sound seems disembodied, like a ventriloquist is throwing their voice. Okay, very funny, I say, turning to my staff. Who said that? They look at each other and Patrice points back to the pen. We think it's notorious, she says. Okay, sure. Forget that these pigs lack the necessary vocal cords for human speech, even if we have genetically modified them for accelerated growth and organ donor optimization. Doctor, this time the pig's mouth doesn't move at all. I'm starting to get annoyed, but there's something about the voice. Again, I say. I hop into the pen, nearly sliding on a piece of shit, and kneel looking into the animal's blue eyes. Say it. Doctor, he says. Jesus. The pig's strange voice, like a mouth filled with cotton balls, reverberates in my mind. After several more tests, there is no mistaking it. The pig's brain, not quite human and not quite swine, lights up like a firecracker on the MRI whenever he speaks. This does not leave the building, not yet, I say. We need to know what we have here, and we don't want someone else taking him away. The staff simply nods, but that isn't good enough for me. I need to hear you say it. Yes, I won't say a word. Yes, I won't say a word, they repeat in unison like we're in grade school. Okay, good. But this isn't some top secret facility. There are no security clearances or repercussions here. The grad students were suspect even before the outbreak, swiping medical supplies for God knows what. I worry it's only a matter of time. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I love that story in particular, and I think that'll lead to my first line of questioning. But a couple questions before the first big topic I want to tackle is the first one in your own words. Who the heck are you?
I'm glad that you sent the questions beforehand, because if you asked me that on the spot without having read that sheet, I would have gone down some like philosophical rabbit hole. But well, my name is Sequoia Nagamatsu. I'm originally from Hawaii in the San Francisco Bay Area. I went to school at Grinnell College in Iowa, where I think promptly decided to embrace environmental activism. More so than my classes in many ways. And that's kind of like where I think my identity as kind of Sequoia was born. I did my MFA at Southern Illinois University. I'm currently an associate professor of creative writing at St. Olaf College, Capricorn on the cusp of Aquarius, INTJ. In other words, I will gladly throw a party, and I love nurturing and organizing events and leading things, but I'll probably ignore half the people there. And I think that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I have a dog named Fenris, named after a Dragon Age video game character, also from Norse mythology, a cat named Kalahira, named after a Mass Effect goddess, and a robot dog named Calvino, after Italo Calvino.
Well, I love Calvino. I have a friend who's a cat named Fenris.
Yeah.
So you've switched species on us, but the same name is carried over there. So the first question we like to ask our guests is always probably the hardest. And I feel like this might be the question you really wanted to look at beforehand, have a moment to think about. So what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? What haven't you gotten to speak about before?
I've gotten certainly a lot of questions over the last few weeks on publishing a book with a plague element during the plague. So I've been talking a lot about that, but not a lot of people have talked about or asked me about my actual process when I'm actually in the zone of writing. And something that is, and maybe it has spilled over, I think, to the tone of my writing, or has influenced me in ways that I can't quite articulate, but I'm a writer that can't write in silence. Often I listen to wordless ambient electronica, like the album Leaf, and that was included as a secret track in my Large Hearted Boy playlist for my novel. But more often than that, I listen to the starship engine rumble of various, Star Trek ships, mostly the Enterprise, sometimes the space station sounds of Deep Space Nine. And it's this kind of low rumble, low humming sound that's on a loop for hours and hours and hours. And I think that has, in a lot of ways, lent a dreamlike quality to a lot of my work over the years.
I didn't know those were available as just no dialogue, no other sound effects loops, but now where do you find those?
YouTube, just like everything else, yeah.
All right, we're all going to YouTube now. We're all going to find our ambient background noises, hopefully from the Starship Enterprise or other Star Trek properties. So good segue, the Discovery, Starship Discovery, genre in general, that this book is, it is a sci-fi book. Clearly, it is a literary novel. Clearly, whatever either of those words actually mean in terms of genre. So let's talk genre. And broadly, just the first broad question, what is genre to you?
that's complex. And I've given a lecture about this at Catapult recently. I think in plain terms, genre is a way of categorizing stylistic conventions. And that's a fairly simple definition, for the word stylistic conventions that are attached to historical literary traditions. That said, I think a lot of people conflate elements of particular genres for the categories themselves. And I was reading a Neil Gaiman interview. I think he was speaking with Kazuo Ishiguro, and they were talking about The Buried Giant, his novel from a couple of years ago. And I think they were both lamenting about the reception of The Buried Giant by some critics, where they were disparaging sort of the fantastical elements of Ishiguro's work. And something that I think either Gaiman or Ishiguro said that really stuck with me is this sense that you can have a rocket ship in a novel and it could still be a very, very deeply literary, realistic novel. You could have a cowboy in a novel and have it be not a cowboy novel. Oftentimes, I think people are conflating the elements of a particular genre for the genre itself, in other words. And there's a lot of snobbery, a lot of, I think, classism and prejudice regarding genres that have, I think, historical seeds that are tied to academia, and also just seeds in terms of the vocabularies that have not evolved in the way that they should have when we talk about literature. We use the vocabulary of realistic fiction when we talk about science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So of course, there's going to be a disconnect in terms of what readers, what critics particularly, are able to unpack if they're using vocabularies not meant for these genres at all.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. And I mean, one of my next question, I believe you answered it, was, are there real divides between genres, or is all that arbitrary? And I really feel you may have already answered that, but if you have any further thoughts on that.
I mean, there are clear reasons for us to have a science fiction section and maybe a literature, like a literary section and a horror section. There is a difference between what you might call a hard science fiction novel versus a soft science fiction novel, and those distinctions can be important for readers, for writers, for editors. That said, I think to call something serious literature, to call something literary, and oftentimes when we say literary, there's a sense that it's more important, that it's quote unquote well written as default, which means that, does that mean that a science fiction novel is not well written if it's not literary? So the distinctions are real, but I think the distinctions are oftentimes a result of communities versus actual content. In other words, how did people rise as a writer? Who were their friends? Where did they initially publish? If, let's say, I had published much more in Asimov's or the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction instead of the Iowa Review and the Southern Review and ZYZZYVA, would people call me literary anything? Or would I be firmly in the science fiction genre camp? And we see kind of this waffling about with certain writers that the academy, that scholars like to claim because they've won major awards or they've inserted themselves in more intellectual conversations. So we have writers like Ursula Le Guin, Margaret Atwood, who's, I think, famously sort of distanced herself from the term science fiction for a long time until somewhat recently. Even Ishiguro, like, how can you categorize a writer like that who is just as famous for a novel about a butler as he is about novels about genetically engineered clones? So it's a complicated question, but Oftentimes I sort of see the genre debate as one that is tied to networks more so than content.
I mean, it's not very well known, but Ishiguro's butler is actually a robot. No, that's not true. No, don't quote me. Don't take that away from this chat in any way. So you held up a Star Trek starship that you're using as a bookmark. And last year we did an event with several writers, myself included, in various genres, and none of them specifically focusing on sci-fi as a thing. But it was a discussion on the influence of Star Trek in their creative work. So we really just talked about Star Trek for an hour and a half, and it was amazing. And we could have talked for like 3 hours because it got really exciting. But it got me interesting reading you, who believes in, I think, blurred genre lines, and who has, I think, very successfully obliterated genre lines in your writing. What are your non-literary, quote unquote literary, whatever that means, or non-written influences? What things do you find yourself going back to that you are touchstones for creative works that you reference that aren't necessarily in the Western literary canon that we know so well?
Well, I think, anything sort of like spacey growing up, I was deeply interested in space exploration. And of course, Star Trek was part of that. I'm also staring at Captain Picard's flute from the episode The Inner Light right now. But so the Cosmos series, I kind of devoured that. I devoured these books that I had as a kid that I begged my family to kind of buy the volume for me. The Time Warner Mysteries of the Unknown. So there was one on UFOs, one on Bigfoot. For children of the 80s, like you'll know them when you see them. They're big black books, and there's kind of like a little image in the center of a UFO or whatever it happens to be. Those were, I think, deeply influential. A&E documentaries of the 90s, particularly, I think, shows like Ancient Aliens, really kind of dug at the fact that I was a history buff, but I was also somebody that I think my wife tells me that I would be a really good cult member because I'm very, very gullible. I'm very impressionable. I'm still deeply fascinated in a lot of conspiracy theories. I don't necessarily believe in these things, but I find the culture and rhetoric of a lot of these communities and these theories deeply fascinating. Beyond that, I think television and film, Babylon 5 was a big one for me, just in terms of thinking about long narrative arcs and how smaller character-oriented narratives would nest in a larger framework. And Babylon 5 was doing that years before, Deep Space Nine was really digging its teeth into, that format. And there's also, I think, in terms of genre blending, a show that was, I think, didn't really get a fair shot. It was, partly by one of the creators of Lost, and that's The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr., which is a Western,
Yes.
a Western series that also incorporated elements of science fiction. And that blew my mind, like when I was a kid, because I was like, wow, like it's a cowboy show, but there's time travel and these weird orbs that are part of the story. And before I discovered Italo Calvino, before I discovered George Saunders, I was already really deeply excited by shows, by books that were merging genres in that way.
I'm glad you mentioned. I don't think I realized the impact of Briscoe County Jr. on my thinking until you just mentioned it now. and we should say, like, there's horrible Western sci-fi like Will Smith's Wild Wild West.
Yeah.
This is not at all what this is like. You can't describe Briscoe County Jr., I think, in the time we have allotted. You'd have to only experience it and know what's going on.
Yeah, there's only sadly one season, and I think you can buy it online. So that's homework for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So just one piece, asking for a piece of advice for maybe some writers who have broad, diverse interests coming from different genres, different mediums. Do you have any advice for someone trying to find themselves within the accumulation of all their interests? How can someone who's broadly geeky, how can they come out and create focused writing from all those different influences? And maybe how did you do that?
Well, I like the term broadly geeky. I think you need to print up those t-shirts. But I think something that I've noticed with my students is that they get really excited about concepts and as somebody that's also broadly geeky, like I can really easily fall down a rabbit hole about black holes or some kind of propulsion system for a starship. But again, my novel, a lot of it is essentially realist domestic fiction. It's fairly traditional. So like, how do I go back to that, even though part of myself is wanting to kind of just look at, the NASA website all day long and kind of like feed those interests. Something that's helped me is that I really need to compartmentalize research and the idea phase of a novel, of a story, whatever I'm working with, away from the actual act of writing. So, and I'm somebody that I'm a fairly slow writer. Like, so I'll, do a lot of research, do a lot of thinking about the concept, about the lives of the characters, and whatever research needs to be done, I'll do that long beforehand, months before, a month before, I just need a pretty concrete amount of time where that knowledge has become organic. It's actually seeped into my bones. And so when I'm actually writing a character, I'm only writing the material that's necessary to forward that character or to forward a scene. And I'm less tempted to fire up Google or Wikipedia or put on my virtual reality headset and discover something, because I'm immersed in the lives of my characters versus whatever fun thing, geeky thing that kind of got me started on the journey. So I think it's perfectly fine to be inspired, have a seed of a story from a geeky thing, but that in itself doesn't a story make. That usually is character.
That reminds me of one of the hardest things, I think, like teaching freshman composition is trying to make freshman college students realize that research isn't to find quotes to support your argument. Research is to form your argument and become an expert in the subject. And the more research and the better you know it, the less you have to quote, because you become a general expert on thinking about the subject. And then you pull in stuff just as like, oh, this person said that as a reference. And that's a very similar process, I think, is just that complete absorption, so that when you're writing, you're not thinking of the research, you're just living the research that you've done or the experiences or whatever influence you're talking about there. So there's a bunch of good questions coming in the chat. I'm going to do one or two more questions before I turn to that. And because you mentioned something, I think it was with Babylon 5, and saying that you learned from that how individual character stories can sort of be set on top of the larger narrative. And as soon as you said that, it made me think of my structure questions about your novel, because that's absolutely what I saw happening here. So it's making me sort of rethink how I was viewing the structure of this novel. But I've been obsessing over the large scale structure of the book. You have chapters that could stand alone, and I think some of them have been published individually as stories that stand alone, but they all contribute to an ongoing thread or ongoing threads that run from the beginning to the end. So what are the threads that, I mean, is that accurate, first of all? And if that is an accurate assessment, what kind of threads do you see sort of carrying through the whole of the novel and tying these individual moments together?
Right. One of the threads is kind of tricky to talk about because it's kind of a spoiler, but
let's get that one then. I'm going to ruin it.
But obviously there's kind of thematic threads, about, and that's really how this novel started, years ago, before I thought it was a novel, before I thought of this as How High We Go in the Dark. I was writing just a lot about grief and funerary practices, and reading a lot of nonfiction books about how we deal with death and capitalist machines around the funerary industry, how we're often not allowed to grieve. Books like, Stiff by Mary Roach and How We Live and How We Die by Sherwin Newland. And a lot of those early chapters, are still there in terms of thinking about how can we create new spaces for grieving and saying goodbye when traditional means are not possible or maybe not enough. And so for a long time, those stories existed as individual stories. And it really wasn't until, so that's one thread, that grief mourning thread is common throughout. And it really wasn't until I wrote, I think, half the book, 2014, I came across this plague element, this plague article in the Atlantic. So that, of course, is a backbone, one narrative backbone for the novel. Everything is reacting to this plague that's introduced in chapter 1. And that's a fairly common, way for novels, for books, for series to function, is there's some kind of big moment and everybody's reacting to it. I think Jerome Stern's books, like I think calls that The Bear at the Door or something like that. Where we're reacting to something. And, when we're thinking about grief, some people allow themselves to purely escape. Some individuals need to immerse themselves in the grief itself to overcome it. And so I was always interested in the different permutations of characters responding to like one moment. There's also the evolution of the world. So several generations pass in this novel, and there's also a chapter where thousands of years pass for individuals because they're on a spaceship and they're in stasis for a lot of the time. So I have to think about, what kind of social media platforms, for example, we might have, in 80 years. Obviously, we're not going to be on a laptop looking at Facebook, at least I would hope. So, in my chapter Grave Friends, they have a kind of, very advanced virtual reality headset, something that I hope sort of comes to be, where it's very immersive. You can smell things. You could buy gloves to sort of touch things and actually feel like you're there with your family members or there in some kind of otherworldly plane. But I also had to think about how the socioeconomic and governmental aspects of the world would evolve, right? So how do corporations respond to mass death? How does that evolve? How does the climate change narrative evolve? So there's grief, there's the plague, there's climate change. And in addition to all of that, the last chapter kind of wraps up everything in a kind of surprising way for a lot of people, depending on how closely you've been reading. So I had to plant Easter eggs throughout to, I guess, build up to that final chapter. I guess all I'll say about that is that there's a character who's basically immortal, and that character does have a presence in some way, shape, or form in most of the chapters. And, for me, that character is one of the most human characters in the novel, despite not being human.
Who is the main character of this novel? Because I thought that was interesting, and I'm not sure I can get to the full line of questions that led to that. But who would you call the main character? And I have a theory, but I'm going to let you go first.
Well, I think there's a couple of. If I had to choose one person, I would either say Cliff, the narrator we begin with. Even though he dies in this chapter, I believe the heart of this character kind of runs through, because it's kind of a primary family that we sort of see. We see his daughter, we see his wife, we see his granddaughter in another chapter. And I feel that Cliff Mirishiro's legacy is allowed to live on, the way that he sort of like reached out for his daughter and tried to reconnect, after her death, think about like what her life meant to her, in the Starship chapter. The other primary character I would see is this other character I just mentioned, who is not human, and has essentially been trying out humanity for all of her life, and adopting different lives and failing and starting families. And but through it all, she's been yearning and reaching out for someone that she's lost as well. And that story is something that almost houses all of the other kinds of yearning and grief in the book.
All right, I don't want to get any closer to spoilers, so I'm going to go to the chat window now, away from my spoilery questions. So the first question from the chat is, were there any chapters or stories that you ended up cutting? And if so, why were they cut? I think it's a great question.
That is a good question. Well, let's see. There's a character that's very briefly mentioned. This is after the plague has been cured, and she's a character who shows up. She was living in Japan for a while, and it's mentioned that she has a lot of tattoos, kind of her travels. And that character had her own chapter where she knew she was terminally ill. The plague had been cured, but she wasn't able to kind of get treatment in time, and so she was essentially dying from, kind of, I guess, side effect from, I guess, not the plague itself, but complications, as it were. And it was called Flay because she had paid a company called Immortal Ink to preserve the tattoos on her skin. And as kind of a memorial, she was going to FedEx basically pieces of her skin preserved under glass, these tattoos to her loved ones and to friends. And so each tattoo carried a story of her life's journey. And, it really kind of focused on this friendship that she had with this other woman. She was attending her wedding. And really no one knew except her mother that she was terminally ill. I ultimately decided to cut that chapter because at that juncture, the only place for me to really include it was after the halfway mark of the novel. And that was a chapter that very much was looking back to the past, looking at this friendship and how it blossomed, why this other woman meant so much to her. But at that point, the novel was looking forward. It was looking to the future. And it didn't make sense in terms of pacing, in terms of the forward movement of the book, for me to ultimately include that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think I feel like that's a pretty normal process too, when you realize the thing's got to go. So never be afraid to cut giant sections of your book is the lesson. Someone says you have a terrific reading voice. Is there an audiobook version? And I guess the part two would be, did you read the audiobook version?
I did not read the audiobook versions. The audiobook version actually is wonderful, but thank you for the compliment to my voice. Maybe I'll do like a Zen sort of yoga tape one day, but
with Starship background noise.
With Starship background noises, yeah. But my wife and I had the opportunity to help cast the audiobook. It's actually a very large cast of voice actors, and a lot of them are Asian American. So which is something that I was hoping we would be able to do. So I was happy to be a part of that process of choosing a lot of Asian talent. But in addition to the Asian talent, there's also some heavy hitters in there. In the, I guess, audiobook world, Julia Whalen, who I think narrated Gone Girl, is also one of the narrators. I think she does the closing chapter. So it's a really wonderful, diverse cast.
Great. So another question from the chat. I am curious, what is the most frustrating aspect of writing, or your least favorite, and how do you overcome that?
I think the most frustrating aspect of writing for me is probably falling in love with an idea. And again, this kind of goes back to being broadly geeky. Falling in love with an idea, and I know that there's a story there one day, but it's not yet a story, short story or a novel. And I sometimes hold on to this idea so hard that I'll write several failed drafts and I'll be wondering, why isn't this working? Why isn't this working? There's no life on the page. And ultimately there's no life on the page because it's basically just a cool idea. and I don't really care about the characters. And the characters really make no sense in this world or with this concept. So what's always tough for me is that I need to shelve those ideas. And I have several files on my computer, kind of the vault, where I have lots of cool ideas, have characters that kind of like are cool characters that don't have stories, a lot of cool places. And maybe one day they'll converge, or I'll decide that this concept makes sense for a storyline I'm working on. But I need to kind of put them away ultimately. And I think that's always tough, because once you've started the drafting process, and you've gone through several drafts of something, putting it away and saying, I'm not the writer for this right now, and maybe I haven't encountered the right books or the right films to teach me how to write this, I think is always a tough but necessary pill to swallow.
And I think learning to let something go for any reason
Mm-hmm.
is such an important skill, that the reward for having written something doesn't have to be sharing it always. Sometimes you realize I'm not the person to write this. I don't have the skills yet. I'm not the person to write this because I'm just not the right person. I don't have the right experience. I don't have the right background. I'm never going to have it no matter what I do. But in writing that, I learned that, or I learned something. And it's writing as a practice, and that is a form of practice. And it's sort of, I guess my point is, it's never wasted. It's never wasted effort. Mm-hmm. It's going to come back to you in some other way, even if that particular document stays in the vault indefinitely and never gets shared with anyone. Mm-hmm. It's still a valuable thing to have done.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So Claire first had a question, but after the question, I think when we were talking about sci-fi, she has next gen or bust. We had some Star Trek: The Next Generation comments, so we have a supporter from the audience. Mm-hmm. So for those of us that are so excited to have discovered your talent, can you tell us what's next?
I have another novel under contract with William Morrow and Bloomsbury. So that one's called Girl Zero, at least for now. And I guess what I can tell you about that is it follows a family. They've lost their daughter, and in this world, I guess kind of mythological creatures or kind of cryptids exist. They're rare, they're going extinct. And the father in the novel seeks out a shapeshifter in the wilds of Japan and replaces his dead daughter. And he and his wife proceed to coach this replacement daughter to, be the girl they lost. This is your favorite park. This is your favorite food. You only eat the strawberry of the Neapolitan ice cream, whatever it may be, right? And this replacement daughter is fulfilling that role. She learns to love her parents. She adopts this identity, but she's also clearly not their actual daughter. She's developing other likes and dislikes, other interests that are very much independent of the girl that she's supposed to be. So it's kind of a coming of age story, a story of identity formation, also a story of grief, because the father recognizes he never loses sight of what he's done, whereas his wife is happy to sort of live in this fantasy. There's a little bit of a twist, because there are other shapeshifters in this cave that also turned into the dead daughter that were extra copies. And I'll leave it at that.
You have a lifelong fan of me. I've already bought this book. I'm going to pre-order it before it's even up for pre-order. So that's great. And I think this is a really interesting question for this book from the chat. Can you share your state of mind while working on this novel and how it affected the revision process?
I mean, I've been working on this thing for in some way, shape, or form, for 10 years. So my state of mind, I guess recently, I'll say the last couple of years, last 3 years, maybe. So before COVID, I think my state of mind was I was very tired. I had been working on this for a long time, and I think I was kind of at the point where I knew this was something. And I think every time my agent emailed me or contacted me, I was kind of hoping that she'd be like, okay, now's the time, we're ready. Let's go out with this. But it would always be like, hey, how about we change more edits, And I was like, oh man, I thought I was done. But again, once I sold it, I wasn't done. Like I still had more edits, and that's something that I think a lot of writers who haven't been through this process doesn't realize, is that like you're never done. You're never done, like until you're actually holding the book, and even then maybe the process, the dialogue between you and your team, and the dialogue that you have with yourself about what this book should be is always evolving and changing. And so I think initially I was very tired, and when COVID broke out, and that was finally the time where my agent said, we're ready. I was like, oh no, like I should be excited, but now I'm just really depressed because what if nobody wants to read this anymore? And so for a while when I was revising this, before we sold it, I think I was in a kind of a dark place, but thankfully we found the partners, editorial partners that shared the vision, that understood that even though there are tough parts of this novel, it's ultimately about hope. It's about community. It's about kind of human nature. And I think in that last stretch of revising, in sort of like the peak of COVID in 2020 and 2021, I think it was kind of a source of light for me, honestly. It's strange to say that editing a kind of a plague book in a pandemic was a cathartic source of catharsis for me. Seems a little odd, but that's what it was, because I was able to, I think, have dialogues with myself about tough things and decisions that family members have to make. And editing a novel and editing a chapter like Elegy Hotel, where a character wasn't able to make the right decision in time to help his mother, allowed me to help make the right decision in my own actual life to call my father before he died. And those were, I think, very, very real. I think even in the moment I recognized that these characters were in some ways saving me to some degree.
Thank you. Another chat question, a good regular writer's question is, do you ever get writer's block? And if so, what inspires you to break through it?
I don't necessarily believe in, I guess, the stereotypical notion of writer's block so much as I believe that our minds have been changed, probably not for the better, because we're just often so distracted. We're constantly consuming some kind of media. And so I think what's happening when I feel stuck at the page is that even if I want to work on something, my mind is being pulled in several different directions. I need to answer this email. I need to be planning some sort of lesson. I want to binge watch something on Netflix, whatever it may be. So I really need to force myself into a quiet place where my mind is engaging with words again. And oftentimes what helps me is just reading. It's just picking up a book and allowing myself to kind of like hear myself read, and read like a writer, and sort of think about, oh, that's a weird sentence that this author used, or when was the last time this author used a period? That's kind of cool. And being able to kind of deconstruct somebody else's words helps me kind of get back into the frame of mind that allows me to actually produce.
Yeah, great. I have a really interesting question in the chat here. So what they love about this book is that some of the ideas are pitch black, macabre humor, while still affecting and heartbreaking. How do you find the balance of humor and absurdity with still grounding your stories in realism? And how do you give yourself permission to take those risks? And I always think too, just to add my own part to that is, I mean, this book is both incredibly sad and incredibly uplifting. Anyway, yes, that question with my little addendum there.
I mean, I think part of that is a question of balance between character and premise, or character and world. If this were more of a, kind of like a 90s Hollywood sort of product, you know, where the pandemic, where the virus was allowed to be the star, then it would be entirely sad. And there would probably be very, very little hope until, you know, some hero kind of showed up with an attack chopper or something. But because I always privileged individuals, I was allowed to let the virus, let the darkness fade away to the background in parts, and think about small individual moments that the characters can engage with, where they are holding on to hope, or where they have some kind of joy in their life. And it could be something as small as listening to music with a friend. It could be something as simple as going outside with your telepathic pig and looking up at the sky and being amazed at kind of the wide-eyed wonder of this creature who's experiencing everything for the first time. Those small moments, I think, are kind of like what help my characters wake up the next day. And again, you know, it's a question of character versus world. I'm always privileging the characters' private moments and interiority and relationships versus the forward motion of the larger society. Like, that element is there, but I'm not going to dive deep into the science or to the sociological, cultural ramifications if I don't need to, because I'm more concerned with individual people.
Mm-hmm. Great. There was one follow-up question. You mentioned the one chapter that you ended up cutting, and the question was, will that story ever be released anywhere, or has it been released anywhere?
Not yet. I'll probably end up releasing it at some point. I think it went under so many changes when I was thinking about should it or should it not be a part of the novel, that I kind of need to kind of go back and make it a standalone piece again. Right now, it's kind of, I think, existing. Its current form is addressing parts of a novel that it's not part of anymore. So
nice. So a good process question. Do you write with the ending in mind, either on a chapter level or on the whole book level, or the overall arc in mind?
On a chapter level, or, you know, coming from like my short story roots, I usually have some kind of end in mind. Whether that actually becomes the ending is another story, but I'm a very methodical writer. I outline to an extreme degree. Have like all kinds of photos and mood boards, and so I like to know what's going to happen, you know. But I allow myself to let that outline evolve as I'm writing, and oftentimes the ending that I had in mind isn't really the ending at all. But I do like to have a place to aim at.
Great. This is an interesting question. How do you write difficult scenes, and then how do you get out of it? I really like the second half of that question, because I feel like difficult scenes, you don't want to necessarily end in difficulty. There is some release there. So, and I think you do that really well.
I think there's a Ben Percy in his book Thrill Me kind of touches on this a little bit, and I liked how he described it in terms of sort of like peaks and valleys. I kind of sort of imagined it as kind of like a sine wave, where if you have like a really difficult moment, you can sort of think about that as the peak, but you need to retreat from that and allow your characters or your world or whatever it may be to have a moment of rest, to reflect on it, to have that, you know, I think Percy described it as a cerebral moment away from the action. And that's something that I try to do in my writing is, you know, if I have a tough moment, I want my characters to have a time to talk about it or have a walk. And I tell this to my students, is that I often see so many opportunities for their for them to sort of deepen who their characters are, and maybe soften certain blows in their stories. And oftentimes this happens in moments of transition in stories. So if we're changing scenes and we see somebody just hanging out in their convertible in their car, well, let's go get a little bit of that. Let's do some world building. Let's have your character give us what's outside, but that's a nice moment of reflection before we actually get to our destination. So I'm always looking for opportunities for my characters to have downtime, because they're, I think, key moments for softening other types of scenes, but they're also just super crucial in terms of things like creating a sense of pace and allowing time to pass in your novel.
Interesting, yeah. Jumping back a little bit in the chat for a question I hopped over there, I think, was we talked a little bit about your research process, but I wonder if you have any more about what your research process looks like. And the second part of that question is, you're a professor as well, so you're not a full-time writer. How necessary is it to immerse yourself in the research process to create a fully fleshed out final work?
Okay, I'll deal with this maybe last bit here first. I was really struck years ago when I was reading an interview with Laura Vandenberg, and somebody, I think, asked her, or the interviewer asked her, like, how do you create these like rich tapestries that are like all in these like foreign countries? and Vandenberg's response was basically Wikipedia. And I think that's an apt response because of course, if you have the time and resources to travel someplace and really kind of smell things and talk to people and all that, that's wonderful. But we live in a world where, yeah, Wikipedia, Google Maps, a virtual reality headset can give you a heck of a lot to provide details to your writing that will ring true enough. And I think that's, the ringing true enough, I think, is kind of key there. Like, you sort of, if you're writing confidently and if you have a few key details in there, more often than not, I think that's going to be enough for the reader. I think I can tell sometimes when, I think especially my students haven't been someplace because there's almost too much detail, where they're naming like every single intersection and cafe. And I'm like, all right, I get it. We're in New York City. Have you ever been there? They're like, no. Like, where are you from? Detroit. All right. Well, how about we write about Detroit? Because there's a lot of New York stories, and probably not enough Detroit stories. And so I'll just say that apart from, I think, kind of the ringing true bit, my own process, I think, starts and I think in a similar place. I'll kind of fire up Google and try to kind of find out what I can. If I need to dig deeper, I might start reading more books about the subject, sometimes even scholarly articles. I might email scientists. In the case of this book, I really wanted to kind of get into the zone of writing sometimes. So I would spend time in virtual reality, floating in space, holding stars, and, looking at the various star clusters and constellations where my starship was headed. So, the research was, content-based, but sometimes, I was researching for, I guess, vibes is kind of maybe a way of putting it. I was researching for tone.
That's really interesting too. I feel I loved your comments too. I feel like with setting, you're just trying to show a place as if it is known. You're not trying to force the place upon someone.
Right.
That, especially if you have a narrator, they're going to explain the places they experience it. They're not going to try to give you the detail point by point. So
right.
Yeah, there's some very interesting, tying it to the character's point of view is so important, I think, in that as well. And that's one of the big, I won't say mistakes because they're not mistakes in writing, but one of the jarring moments in reading sometimes I see is when someone is, the character we're focusing on right now wouldn't notice all those things that were just listed.
Right.
And that also pushes it beyond the realm of reality for me when I'm reading. So we're basically at the end right here. So I do want to ask the final question of the evening, and that is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
Well, if the writers, I think I tell this to my students, so they're kind of at a particular stage in life, but I think this applies to most anyone really, is just to take your time, be on your own clock. I think sometimes I need to take this advice myself, but I think one of the worst things that you can do for your writing is paying too much attention to the trajectories, at least the superficial trajectory of other writers. And you don't really know their stories or kind of like what's behind their journey. All you see is the surface. And, you know, that tip of the iceberg for another more successful writer might tell you that you have some kind of imaginary clock hanging over your head and that you need to kind of follow that clock in order to be successful. I think you should just be writing stories that you want to write, not thinking about audience or market, at least at first. I think those are conversations that are useful to have at some later point. But I think if you're just starting out and you're just drafting and discovering your voice and what you like, you just chase those passions and chase those interests and not worry so much about some kind of vision of what kind of writer you should be. And I think as a writer of color, I think I dealt with some of these issues in a very real way where, you know, and some of this was the publishing industry and just the world. But, you know, when I first started writing, there weren't a lot of, we weren't having these conversations about identity as we are now. And so a lot of the literature I saw, a lot of the films and TV I saw were about Asian lives that were were very othering in a lot of ways, and were kind of pandering to kind of a majority audience and weren't, you know, as well written as they are and as wonderful as some of these books and shows and movies are. You know, I feel like a lot of writers of color today and a lot of just, you know, LGBTQ plus writers today are able to navigate their own narratives in a way that is on their own terms, which, you know, this is something that I definitely wish for my students and for all writers is to write on your own terms.
Well, thank you. I love that. I've loved this conversation. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out. Sequoia, thank you so much. Everyone, please go check out this book. Buy a copy if you can from your local independent bookseller or online from bookshop.org, or go get, thank you to the appearance by the Starship Discovery. I love this book so much. I'm going to gush on it one more time. Sequoia, I'm seriously excited for the next book you just described. And you have, I'm looking forward to, I'm going to say a good solid dozen in the next, I'm giving you a decade to put out a dozen books, just so you know. So that's what I'm expecting for the next decade. But thank you so much. Thank you all for who came out tonight. This was a fantastic conversation, and we hope to see you again at our Writer Center event. Thanks, everyone.